I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, a new critique coming out of the U.S. State Department slamming Israel for its settlement policy. In a release dated July 27th, the State Department characterizes Israeli communities on the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as, quote, corrosive to the cause of peace, systematically undermining the prospects for a two-state solution, entrenching a one-state reality of perpetual occupation and conflict, and as provocative and counterproductive, unquote. To the United States State Department, settlements are still seen as the major obstacle to peace, not only between Israel and Palestinians, but to peace in the entire region. Well, how justifiable is this State Department criticism of Israel? One career diplomat is strongly critical of the State Department's position on Israeli settlement policy, even calling it willful, slanted, and malicious, and raises some questions, serious questions, as to the basic knowledge, seriousness, professionalism, and responsibility of whoever approved the issuance of this statement. Well, these rather outspoken, even courageous comments were published in a piece by Ambassador Alan Baker, Israel's former ambassador to Canada, who currently serves as director of the Institute for Contemporary Affairs at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, obviously in Jerusalem. Alan has a most distinguished career in Israeli foreign service, having negotiated and drafted with Palestinians the Oslo Accords, as well as the peace treaties between Egypt and Israel and Jordan and Israel. And it's an honor for us to have Alan Baker on our JBS phones from Jerusalem. Alan, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome, Mark. Good to speak to you.
Thank you. I told you off camera, Alan, I have covered you a number of times for JBS. Every time I've just been mesmerized by you. I think you have enormous insight. And so it's a real pleasure to have you one-on-one on the phones with us. Again, thank you for giving us the time.
You're welcome.
Alan, have I characterized your reaction to the State Department's release accurately? You write.
Accurately, yes. But I think you've even understated it, because what I said and what I feel is that whoever wrote this and whoever approved it, whether it's the Secretary of State himself or whether it comes from the U.S. Embassy in Israel, whoever it is, seems to feel that Israeli settlements are not just an obstacle to peace, they're an obstacle to world peace. And there's nothing else happening in the world except Israel's settlements. And there's no global warming, and there's no hunger, and there's no ISIL, and there's no Syria. The only thing that seems to interest the State Department are Israel's settlements. And this seems to me curious. It seems to me some type of fixation by somebody who really is vastly exaggerating the whole issue.
Yes, I do want to quote one more piece from your article where you write, the State Department comments on Israeli settlements are nothing more than a sad, disproportionate, political exaggeration out of all proportion to settlements' actual size or significance. Alan, from your perspective, what you say is they have grossly exaggerated, overstated the case. Are the settlements at all, in your mind, an obstacle? Not the obstacle, not necessarily the largest obstacle, but how would you characterize the problems posed by Israeli settlements to the peace process?
The issue of Israel's settlements are an issue on the negotiating table between the Israelis and the Palestinians. This is what we agreed upon in the Oslo Accords. The same Oslo Accords that President Bill Clinton signed and witnessed and approved The UN also endorsed them, as did the EU and the Russians and Egypt and Jordan and others. So the fact that settlements are a negotiating issue and this permanent status hasn't yet been agreed upon between Israel and the Palestinians means that if the State Department is now coming, and not just the State Department, but also the Europeans, and saying that, well, the settlements are preventing peace, then they're prejudging a negotiating issue. Mm-hmm. The Israelis and the Palestinians themselves have agreed that settlement is a negotiating issue. Now, the obstacle to peace at the moment is the fact that the Palestinians can't get their act together in order to come back to the negotiating table with Israel. Mm-hmm. That's the reason that there's no progress in the process.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, you anticipated my next question. By the way, the United Nations recently published their finding, and they said for the first time, Palestinian incitement is also an obstacle to peace, although they did cite the settlements as well. If I were to say to you, Alan, Palestinian rejectionism of any proposal in which they would agree to share the land with a non-Muslim entity, especially a Zionist entity, if they are refusing to the concept of sharing, and that is the ultimate stumbling block, to what extent would you feel I'm articulating it correctly?
100% correctly. I would go even further. A month and a half ago, the foreign minister of the Palestinian Authority, when he was visiting Japan together with Mahmoud Abbas, he made a press statement saying that the Palestinians no longer intend to return to the negotiating table with Israel, which means basically that they're violating the very basis of the Oslo Accords, which is to solve all issues through negotiation. Mm-hmm. If they're refusing to negotiate, then how, in good conscience, can anybody accuse Israel of being an obstacle to the negotiations or to the peace?
Mm-hmm. Talk to me a moment from your legal and diplomatic perspective on whether the settlements are, quote, internationally illegal. Every now and then we hear that charge that the settlements are in essence, not only simply immoral, not simply unwise, they are illegal. Alan, are settlements illegal?
Absolutely not.
Explain
they're
why.
Not illegal, and they're not immoral, and they're not unwise. Israel's position has always been that as soon as it entered the territories in 1967, international law enabled Israel, whether as an occupying power or as an administering power, however you look at it, to administer property which is not private property and to enjoy the fruits of this property. This is written in international conventions that deal with issues of administration of territory that's occupied. So there's absolutely nothing against using land which is not privately owned to build on or for agricultural purposes, as long as it's clear that in the event that there's a peace agreement and this land changes hands, then it's not owned by the people who are sitting there who received it in order to live there. Mm-hmm. Now, this is what Israel's done, and this isn't a violation of international law. The provision that's always quoted against Israel, the 1949 Geneva Convention, which prohibits the forced mass transfer of populations from an occupier's territory into occupied territory, was drafted immediately after the Second World War.
Yes.
In order to prevent a recurrence of what the Nazis did to the populations of Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary. the situation with Israel is absolutely nothing like this, and therefore any parallel to this is not just wrong; it's vicious.
It's outrageous. You're absolutely right.
Yes.
By the way, from your perspective again, how would you characterize the way in which successive American administrations, how presidents have defined the legitimacy or illegitimacy of Israeli settlements? Has any president, I know the answer, but I want you to, has any president called Israeli settlements illegal?
Well, I wouldn't say a president, but I, as far as I know, several secretaries of state have used the term illegal. During the period of President Reagan and President Bush, the younger Bush, the term obstacle to peace was used. And John Kerry and Obama have reverted back to expressions such as illegitimate. But an interesting point here is, in this State Department statement that was made, for the first time, the State Department is referring to Israeli areas in Jerusalem as being settlements. And this is novel, this is something new, and this is something very disturbing.
Mm-hmm. But they are speaking about East Jerusalem, are they not?
Of course, but it's part of Jerusalem. It's part of Jerusalem that everybody is fully aware of the fact that will not change hands. And in any agreement, the issue of Jerusalem is a separate negotiating issue. And again, by referring to it in this way, the State Department is prejudging an issue that the Palestinians themselves have agreed is a negotiating issue. And
yes.
This is what disturbs us. The fact that the Israelis and the Palestinians have managed to come to an agreement, basically acknowledging the fact that each of them has rights, and therefore that there's a dispute between us, and this has to be negotiated in good faith. Mm-hmm. So why then does the State Department feel that it can come along and prejudge this negotiation when mm-hmm. the Palestinians themselves and the Israelis are still waiting to settle this issue?
By the way, Alan, when you're all by yourself or you're speaking with your wife, how do you answer the question to yourself, why is the State Department doing this? I know you may not have the exact answer, but what's your instinct? What's behind this?
Well, look, I think that to a certain extent there's an effort in the international community to pamper the Palestinian leadership and to encourage it and to strengthen it, because it's known that the Mahmoud Abbas is in a very difficult position. He has no public support. His health is very shaky. He's very old. I think he's over 80, and therefore the State Department feels that they need to buttress his position in order to ensure that the Palestinian Authority, which in their eyes is far more reasonable than Hamas, they will continue to function. Israel is not so sure at the moment, because the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas and his people, are the ones who've been inciting to violence.
Yes.
They're the ones that have encouraged this recent outbreak of stabbing and running people over in the streets.
Yes.
So it's difficult to know whether what the State Department is doing isn't encouraging mm-hmm. the Palestinian Authority to continue doing what it's doing when they know that whatever they do, they won't be criticized.
Yes. Alan, you were ambassador to Canada for the State of Israel. Where were you born?
I was born in England.
You were born in England?
In the north of England, yes.
Okay. As you look from Israel, by the way, you are now an Israeli citizen, and again, you represent...
I've been an Israeli citizen for more than I was a British citizen.
Okay. As an Israeli, you're an Israeli diplomat, but as an Israeli, how does it make you feel when you see the United States, an ocean away, the government of the United States, making these kind of pronouncements about things which are so clearly wrong to you? And I don't mean wrong, morally wrong. They're factually wrong, they're legally wrong, they're inappropriate. How does the Israeli react when America and an American administration, American State Department, takes this kind of stand?
Well, I think the first reaction is disbelief, and that's why in the piece that I wrote today in today's Jerusalem Post, I said at the end something is very, very, very wrong in the State Department, because it's completely out of line, and it doesn't fit in with the strong relationship that exists between the United States and Israel. Mm-hmm. So that there's somebody who's sitting there with a fixation and is being allowed to drag the State Department into an issue which I'm not sure whether this is really in the interests of the United States. Mm-hmm. But there again, the United States wants to line its position with the European position, and the Europeans have got no love for Israel. So there are various reasons for this, but the average Israeli is surprised, shocked, and extremely concerned, especially after what we've seen from the Democratic Convention and the Democratic campaign, where Bernie Sanders and others were came up with an extremely anti-Israel position.
Mm-hmm. Again, your analysis is fascinating for us to hear and to understand. I want to ask you another question that comes out of the things we read all the time here in the United States. And sometimes the things are written by very highly respected academicians, some of whom are Israeli, some of whom have been involved in diplomacy, as you have. And what we see often is a criticism of Israelis building on Palestinian land. Alan, from a international legal perspective, are settlements being built on Palestinian land?
Look, when you use the term Palestinian land, it's a very vague thing that you're saying, because there's private land owned by private individuals, Palestinians or Jews or Israelis, and there's land which is not private, which is public, which is government land. Now, according to international law, any settlement built on private land has got no justification and has to be removed, or the owners have to be compensated. Here, there's no argument, there's no question. The Israeli courts are very strict in enforcing this situation. In the event that somebody has built on private land, whether deliberately or not unknowingly, then the Israeli courts come down very strongly against this. But any building which is not on private land, which is on public land, land that it clearly has no ownership, that was previously owned by the government of Jordan, which became under the control of Israel, and therefore Israel has the right, according to international law, to use this land. So one can't call it Palestinian land, it is public land. And this leads me, Mark, to another issue. The term that's bandied about all the time in the United Nations, occupied Palestinian territory.
Yes.
Now, there's no such thing. There's no Palestinian sovereignty. There's never been any international treaty or agreement or contract or binding resolution that declares any of this territory to be Palestinian. That's the whole point of the Oslo Accords, to determine the final status. So the term occupied Palestinian territory is in itself a completely misleading term.
Yes. Now, I don't want people to misunderstand you or to assume you're saying things you're not. as we look at it, we know there is Israeli administration of what is called the West Bank, Judea, Samaria. And we also understand that the people, the Arab Palestinians who live on the West Bank, experience it as occupation. And that occupation normally is a word used when an army is involved in some kind of control of territory that is not formally theirs. The West Bank is not formally part of Israel, but there are Israeli soldiers on the West Bank. To that extent, it seems fair to people to use the word occupation. And I want to know if you're making a distinction, a very important distinction, between occupation as an experience that the Palestinians are living with and occupied territory as a word that really does not apply to the land known as the West Bank. Speak to me a moment about how you would use the word occupation, and to what extent are you in some way understanding of, or even sympathetic of, the Palestinian experience of Israeli control of the West Bank?
The term occupation in international law is a defined term, which means that State A occupies the sovereign territory of State B during the course of a war. Now, with respect to the situation here in Israel, between Israel and its neighbors, Israel indeed occupied territory, but it didn't belong to any sovereign state, because the West Bank had been previously occupied by Jordan and annexed by Jordan. It wasn't even recognized as Jordanian territory. So there's a unique situation here. We lawyers call it sui generis. It's a special situation where, in actual fact, the presence of Israel in the territories doesn't fall within the strict definition of occupied territory. But nevertheless, Israel hasn't annexed this territory, and Israel has committed itself to negotiate the final status of this territory with the Palestinians. In the meantime, Israel is obliged by international law to administer the area, and the Israeli forces, therefore, are legally present in the area, at least in Area C, in part of the area, because areas A and B, the other parts of the West Bank, Israel has given back to the Palestinians. Israel's presence in this area is there with the agreement of the Palestinians, and all this pending negotiation. So it's difficult to call it occupation by the formal term of the word, but nevertheless, Israel is dealing with the local population in accordance with its obligations according to international law to ensure that the local population, their property rights and other rights are guaranteed, and to ensure that they're governed in a reasonable and just manner.
This is a very complicated issue. It is even complicated for Israelis. I want to tell you something you just said, and I want you to explain to me what you meant by it. You were talking about areas A, B, and C, and you said that in two of those areas, Israel does, the phrase you used, Alan, Israel has given back those areas to the Palestinians. When you say Israel has given back, it sounds as if it belonged to them, was taken by Israel, and Israel has said, yes, this is yours, we're going to give it back to you. Did you mean it that way?
Not exactly. When I say given back, I mean that Israel agreed to withdraw from these areas and acknowledge the fact that the Palestinians have control and jurisdiction over the areas that that Israel transferred to them. At the same time, the whole issue of the permanent status of the territories is agreed upon as a negotiating issue that has yet to be negotiated. But the assumption is that parts of the territories, in other words, Area A are all the large Palestinian towns, Ramallah and Jenin and all the other places, which are highly populated. Area B is about 150 Palestinian villages. And Area C is basically an area which is hardly populated at all by Palestinians, and it's the area where Israel's army bases and settlements are there. And so in areas A and B, Israel has transferred control and responsibility and jurisdiction to the Palestinians. The only jurisdiction that Israel reserves for itself in the event that this is necessary is an overall security jurisdiction in Area B in the event that there's a necessity to deal with impending terrorist attacks or something like that.
All right, one more quick question for you. How legitimate is it for Israel to require that the Palestinians recognize the Jewishness of the state of Israel, that Israel is a legitimate Jewish state? How important is that, Alan?
Well, it's become a central and vital component of Israel's expectations from the Palestinians. There are several issues that have to be negotiated. For instance, refugees, and the initial Palestinian position has always been that there are about 5,000 refugees, 5 million refugees, including descendants and nieces and nephews and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and they want them all to come back. And they want them all to come back to the territory which is now Israel. And therefore Israel considers it very important for the Palestinians to acknowledge the fact that Israel is the state of the Jewish people in the same way that any future state of Palestine, once agreed upon, will be the state for the Palestinian people. And once this situation exists, then those Palestinians that would want to come and live in a Palestinian state, and assuming that that state would have the capability of absorbing them, of providing water for them, of providing housing for them, then this would be possible. But to enable wholesale immigration of Palestinians into Israel is something that Israel can't agree to, and this would be part of the negotiation.
Mm-hmm. Alan, you are absolutely fabulous. It's so kind of you to give me this much time. You are a wealth of knowledge, experience, and you articulate it so beautifully. You've been a big help to the JBS audience. I really hope, Alan, one day if you're visiting the United States, you'll come sit with me in person at our JBS studios, or even if I'm in Israel, I'll have a chance to meet with you in person then. You have done fabulous work, and you've done fabulous service for the state of Israel. It's been a real honor to speak with you.
Thank you. Same for me.
Be well. The thoughts of Alan Baker, Israel's former ambassador to Canada, current director of the Institute for Contemporary Affairs at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. And again, he has seen it all. As always, my thanks to our director, Sloan Copeland, program coordinator, Serge Goldberg, editor, Dennis Golan, to JBS associate director, Dara Golub, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.